everyone. I'm Sarah Christensen with One Sage's View Astrology. Welcome back. We are doing the playlist for the Astrology of the promo tour for season 3 co-leads Nicola Coughlan and Luke Newton. And we're going to focus in on Toronto, which was on June 3rd and probably June 4th. I don't know when they left Toronto, but we're just going to focus on kind of like 2 days in Toronto, Canada, maybe that they left on the 3rd day. But I know that they had to be in Dublin by June 6th. So I would assume that they were only in Toronto for one night and then flew over to Ireland. So let's focus on that astrology and kind of consider what was in the energy, what was in the perception from those interviews. I believe that is the BuzzFeed interview that we actually got the information from the end of the interview for their astrology for the rising signs. So I am very interested in the information for Toronto myself. And also there was a lot of different things that came out of the interviews specifically in Toronto from the perception that we got from Luke Newton when he was in interviews with the talk show host, I think. I can't remember if that was a morning talk show program or something, but when they were asking Nicola about, other leads that which she would consider from Canada, and she mentioned Ryan Gosling, of course, and of course we got to bear witness to Luke's nervousness or jealousy maybe underneath all that, right? So the way he responded in that, it kind of was a little bit of a tell. And, and that's what we were fascinated by, is how much we could see in each stop that they made and each interview that they gave, kind of different signals and that we would pick up on in their body language, because there's so much information that comes from the instinctual nature of someone and how much is revealed through the body language. So I find that fascinating. So this is going to be a fun video. Again, we're having fun with astrology, and of course it's for entertainment purposes only, even though we can learn a lot from just the basics of astrology as we go. And I will be adding on some videos with some very basic things around the planets here soon. And that will kind of start building your knowledge on this. And then you can go back and revisit pieces of the playlist of the Bridgerton to, kind of gather new insights. Because I know a lot of those who are listening are very beginners or haven't done any studies whatsoever in astrology. So thank you for responding to the poll that I did, because that, kind of confirmed for me and validated what I had a hunch that there was a lot of beginners listening and very interested. And I kind of take it as a little bit of a responsibility to give you some more information about astrology, because you have picked up on this fascination, and yet you're interested enough to watch even a little bit of the videos and curious that it might provide you some insights, answers. And again, ideally in astrology, we like to have a birth time to actually create the angle of the chart, because the rising sign is very, very important. And the degree that it is down to the minute when you were born. And so when you have that kind of information, it actually sets up there are different house systems, and I'm using a whole sign house system, which is really easy. Traditional astrology is super complex, but it's nice to be able to speak to astrology with the simplicity of the whole sign house system. But the angles of what create, the power of a chart is based on the accurate birth time. And I want to point that out because I think that we have a lot of some generalizations that we have to kind of keep in mind, because we don't know, for example, exactly the degree and the minute of Nicola's ascendant, and Luke's is even a little bit more questionable, because it could be that he's later in the day. And if it's later in the day, then there is a chance that he could be Virgo rising and a Leo moon. That there is a possibility of that. And I was going to explore that in future videos, of course. But I want to point out that having the angles is so powerful in astrology, because it's basically the cross of life. I like to kind of make this, so you can see, it makes the strength of the astrology that much more potent, and the validity of it, I think, is more powerful, even though we have been able to do a lot of exploration just on whole signs, just having kind of an indication of where that is. And evolutionary astrology, for the most part, they're not using a whole sign system at all. They're either using Placidus, which is very common in a lot of books, especially that's what Stephen Forrest used, who is my master teacher. I know that Jeffrey Green, who did the Pluto books, he uses a porphyry house system, which is more of an equal, it's almost like an equal house, but it was easy to calculate before computers. So a lot of, and it's actually really ancient, the porphyry system. So there's a lot to take into consideration as you get, further into the studies of astrology based on your interest for it. So I want to point that out, that as we go along, and when I'm looking at other charts in another playlist, when I do other chart analysis, you'll see the potency of what the angles are when we have an accurate birth time. And I think probably one of the first charts that I will do will probably be Zendaya. She is a very prominent public figure, and in the generation that maybe that interests you. And we have her birth time, so we have angles. And also with celebrity individuals, we have a lot of information about timings if there are certain things in the life, so we can kind of show that in the in the process of teaching something about astrology. So and I appreciate that there is something about being a public figure and having your life open for dissection from people. But I think it's more and more interest as we continue to move into the Aquarian age about the power of astrology and other esoteric disciplines. So I just want to point that out, and I'm grateful for those individuals who have shared their birth time. And in the future, you also see that in my astrology, I will occasionally use myself as an example. In astrology circles, sometimes people think that's great or not so great. It depends. I think it's a useful tool, because one of the most powerful things that you could bring is that yourself. The more you study astrology, the more that you realize how it validates your experience. It's so powerfully, but it's also can help you guide you through challenging times. And we're just now coming off the lunar eclipse that happened. I'm recording this on September 20th. No, today is September 19th, excuse me. So the eclipse was just Tuesday. So there's a lot that's coming off of this very, very powerful lunar eclipse in Pisces. And I'll do a little bit on that later. But I think what's interesting in terms of Nicola is Nicola was recently at the Emmy Awards, and on the red carpet, she had an experience of being eclipsed by people walking in front of her when she was being photographed. So you can have these kind of very literal experiences that kind of highlight something in the the cosmic planetary transits. And that was Nicola's experience, because I think they started maybe 5-6 o'clock, but that eclipse was around 7:35 p.m. Pacific time. So often you have these you can have these things that happen in the very kind of public and maybe really noticeable when you have somebody like a public figure get eclipsed like that. That was interesting, because she is in a Jupiter year, which is her Jupiter's in Pisces, and very near where the eclipse was happening in terms of degree. So it's not surprising she would have this kind of moment. The question I always then I take it, you see these moments that are caught like that, just like when I had made the comment about Luke tripping over her veil when she was in the London premiere. And to me, that was almost like an omen of his stumbling over things related to feminine, the goddess, and those kinds of things. So I like to kind of look at things with another pair of eyes. And I think it's a great exercise, because there's so many detectives and people interested in understanding all the clues that are interested in Luke Newton and Nicola's, whatever they're presenting public facing, and what also is trying to be hidden, and then what gets leaked out, because I've mentioned that they both have this strong desire to hold things private, but there are also things in their chart that will show up as potential areas for leaks into the public. And so I think it's interesting to look at the astrology, what's going on in the planetary transits, and that kind of helps us understand a little bit about as above, so below, as above. And I think that's important to kind of start bringing to life astrology. So I hope you will join me in diving into this video, and I love your comments. Your comments are fantastic. I do have at the end, I will probably look at some questions that some people have. Actually, let's just cover those questions right right now that people have asked. One of them was, I had two very, very different perceptions based on the Toronto interviews and people's perception. One thing that we picked up on, especially in the BuzzFeed interview, was that they were both sniffly and, coming down with a cold or something like that. And others, in terms of tired, and others were more relaxed in Toronto. And then someone their perception was that they were more professional in their questions, how they approach the questions. So, and I think that that's the contrast between Rio de Janeiro and what was happening in Rio de Janeiro, and then what they would do and pick up in Toronto. So I think we want to kind of keep in mind that they've just come off of Rio de Janeiro. There was a peaking moment. Now, Rio was absolutely the peaking moment that then it would start building towards what was going to happen on June 12th, because there had have to be some closeness and specific things that were shared. So when we got to June 12th, there would be this catalyst moment for Luke. And I think that evolutionary astrology speaking on that one, to me, that was the catalyst for him to open up and explore some things that are deeper subject. And Nicola would be a participating soul who would be important for him, because in terms of keeping the relationship, what he'd have to do to repair, if there was a need to repair certain things, because I think he was sensitive to her emotions, because that was visible in some of the videos that have come out since, and the New York premiere. So I think that was a building thing, and it just was boiling up to that point for June 12th. So Toronto was this point, before, Toronto, and then they bounced over to Dublin, and then to Galway, and then down, and then to London, kind of 3 more stops, right? Before that final premiere, before part 2 was released. So I think what we want to kind of keep in mind is what we're getting and receiving from Luke Newton, how Nicola is showing up, and, kind of what their energy is telling us, because we have our 2 eyes to observe, and that's why we're all questioning, what is this thing, because there may be statements that are saying one thing, and then the instincts and how people, body language, all that, indicate something else, is on a much deeper level going on. And I absolutely agree with that 100%. And so let's dive in, let's check it out. And if you have any more questions, I think you're going to see in what I present, both can be like, they probably are getting tired. That's why they got sick in Toronto, where we're seeing that they're, falling ill with, a bit of a cold when they get to Toronto. And then also they may be more professionally applying the questions or Q&A of the interviews in a more, polished, because of the energy in Toronto is like that, right? So I kind of think the vibe and energy of Rio is very sexy, very sensuous. And of course the energy was mirroring that. By the time they get to Toronto, we're definitely with the Jupiter in Gemini. There has been the shift. So people are observing it in a different shift. They're but chaos is starting to also show in different ways that leak out in terms of body language and things like that. So I think we want to pay attention to those combination of things, because the energy has changed, and Jupiter changing signs from Taurus to Gemini between Rio and Toronto is very important, because Jupiter is the planet that is the Lord of the year for both Luke and Nicola. Nicola's, where her own Jupiter is in Pisces and also in Eros, and then Luke has just planets moving through his 8th house of Pisces, but it'll be about relationships, because in Luke's chart, Jupiter is connected to Libra and his 3rd house of communication. So he's going to be learning about communications and things like this. Also, I think people don't realize the powerful differences of the 2 houses that they are, because it's the kind of the Lord of the year from a traditional astrology standpoint. So Nicola's in a 2nd house, because it's Aquarius, then is their 1st house, and then 2nd house is Pisces. So she's going to be understanding her, going through, experiences of gaining more money, gaining more income, the potential for assets, because she's rising, right? The 2nd house is about what you earn in money, but you also value yourself, where you might have to deal with things that, you have to strengthen up your self-confidence. You might hit some bumps in the road, because when Jupiter goes into Gemini, it squares that energy. And if you recall, Nicola's 5th house is Gemini, and that's the creative part. It's also the house for babies and children. but it's more that it's very creative. But she has like a wound there with Chiron. So she's going to experience, when Jupiter goes into Gemini, some kind of experience that puts some tension, from that square. And then Saturn is also in Pisces, kind of making it a squared tension, right? Luke is going through the Pisces also, but in the 8th house. And the 8th house is about the values of other people. So he's going to be experiencing things in this year of being 31 about other people's money, other people's values. So he's going to have to confront very difficult things around communication, perception. He's having to navigate that the way it is in his chart. So even though they're both having a Jupiter Lord of the Year, the experience is very different. 8th house is so much more challenging than a 2nd house in my book. It is very, very different. Okay. When they both have a birthday, it'll go, Luke will move to a 9th house when he turns 32. And Nicola, when she has her birthday in January, she'll go to the 3rd house, and her 3rd house is Aries. So we'll see she'll have more Mars, more interesting parts and things that she's acting on, working out, which are, attributed to her comedy, perhaps, in one frame, but in another, Mars is about how you deal with conflict and confronting conflict, or having to be courageous. So the roles that will be visibly that she's producing and acting in will be heavy Mars related when she turns 38. Okay. So there are so many things in astrology, just kind of the moving parts. So it's almost like, complicated clock. I hope that when I start sharing, short videos about the planets, you'll get a little bit more insight. But it's a complicated system, because you have the whole background of the whole zodiac. There's 12 signs, and then you lay in, there's fire, earth, air, and water. So you have 4 elements, and then you have 3 modalities. So 4, 3 on top of that 12, right? And then you have all the planets moving through that and giving different aspects. So it can get quite complicated, but it is something that once you start living and breathing it and studying your basics, you'll start picking it up just by listening to the videos about something that you're interested in. You start picking up some of the language, you start picking up some of the archetypal symbolism. And that's the core of astrology, is starting to pick up some of that language. And in the very beginnings, when I first started studying astrology, I would watch multiple videos as well, whoever I liked listening to in their voice. But I found teachers that were fascinating to me. And I think those that are also accessible would be important, because if in the future you ever want to seek them out, you have that ability to. That was one of my deciding factors by going towards Stephen Forrest versus going towards Jeffrey Green, because at the time that I entered astrology, Jeffrey Green was more of a recluse at that point, and Stephen Forrest had his apprentice program. So I joined the AP program, and that's how I became an astrologer. So anyway, I hope you enjoy this video, and let's get started and dive in and have some fun. Okay, we are getting to the slides here for Toronto, so let's dive in. So as we look at Toronto, we want to take a look at just kind of I'm doing this as a noon chart. It is likely that on June 3rd, they probably were up earlier than that and doing some photos and things like that. I believe they did the little videos and things like that for part of the promo for the tour as well. And so I'm just taking a noon to get a general sense of where the moon is in that time. The ascendant, moves so quickly. So I'm not going to zero in on the ascendant per se. It's more that I'm looking at where's the moon movement in that day and then in the next day. Okay. So looking at this chart, it's kind of standing out a couple of things that are occurring in Toronto when they're there. And the moon is in Taurus, which is kind of still accentuating the Taurus energy about sensuality, the subject of sensuality, and those kinds of things. So, and I think the moon would probably, yes, absolutely would be in Gemini when they take off to go to Ireland. Okay. So when they're heading to Dublin, that moon will finish off Taurus and then be in Gemini when they take off. right? So this is Luke's chart on the inner in the green, and on the outer is the moment kind of around noon, noontime Eastern time in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And the moon at that time is at 5 degrees of Taurus. And so for Luke, it's kind of like the moon is accentuating his career and highlighting, that part of the self that's public facing and visible. So with the moon in Taurus, it is really going to be showing the visibility of his emotional parts of self. Maybe he wants more hidden, but they're going to be visible in terms of his responses. So the moon is accentuating kind of this self and other. So when we look at first house, this is the 7th house here, and this is the first house here. And when the moon is moving through the 10th house, it kind of T-squares it like that. Now, as that moon gets closer and closer to Uranus, that is going to accentuate the opposition of that energy, because that's a transiting Uranus. That's the planet moving in real time, but Uranus moves fairly slow. It'll be the moon that would make it reactive, right? So that moon, when it moves over that point, over that planet, it then adds kind of an energy of pulling things into tension. So we see the tension on his face or visible or whatnot, and it has a tone to it that's jealous. And jealousy is kind of it's a thing that is represented by Taurus and Scorpio. Okay. So when I look at the feelings, the experience of jealousy or envy, I kind of like where someone has trust or a lack of trust. Those are the combinations that come from a Scorpio and a Taurus moon. Okay. Or not just the moon, but planets in those. The moon just in this moment is accentuating that and triggering it. It's activating it. So it's adding that element into, it's going to basically, add energy in the time that they are there to this very difficult part of his chart, when we have his Mercury square the Pluto in Scorpio of his natal chart, because his natal Mercury will be something that's activated as well. His Saturn will activate. That's the part of the self that, thinking it's other people, but it's actually himself. And then his 6th house of what he is in service to the world. 6th house is also, in the traditional sense, bad fortune. Not something that evolutionary astrology doesn't look at it like that. They look at 6th house as more what you're in service to the world more. But to me, it's both. I can look at, these two different disciplines of astrology, of evolutionary astrology, who looks at it as a place where we look for what are you in service to in some greater capacity. But in ancient astrology, in the traditional Hellenistic point of view, if you had stuff happening in your 6th house, you might be concerned that you would be a slave or you were an indentured servant or something like that. It was considered a bad fortune house. And that was before they knew about the outer planets, of course. Saturn was the limit. And that's what they knew, because they could see it with their visible eye in the ancient world. When humanity was becoming more, the consciousness was rising, there was an awareness of Uranus, and then there was an awareness of Neptune, and then there was an awareness of Pluto. And we'll discuss those in another video, but it's very important to understand, like, we know about psychology because of the emergence and awareness of that planet within our solar system and its orbit to the sun, and what that meant for us collectively when it came online. Okay. So this is kind of like, there's different perspectives, and they both still are valid in the conscious, like how we might perceive something. So I kind of think it's important to look at it from both perspectives. And I think, a lot of people think, oh my gosh, that's too confusing to study two different disciplines of astrology. But I think, I think it's viable to, if you can hold that much information, I think it's valuable to you. If you want to focus in on one discipline, that's fantastic. That will give you that piece of the, to work with and to navigate. But I kind of look at it from, it's valuable to look at different points of view and what that gives us. It's a perception thing, right? So 6th house, evolutionary astrology. What are you in service to? What's your work? These kinds of things. And it's also a relationship between like a teacher and a student, like a mentor and a mentee. It kind of gives some symbolism around that. That's evolutionary astrology. Traditional astrology looks at 6th house as more of a bad fortune house. And that meant 11th house was more of the fortunate house. Okay. The good fortune house was house 11, because that was a house that was symbolically like rising to the 10th. which is like being the friend to the king. Okay. And I think I've mentioned this in other videos. But in that moment in Toronto, in terms for Luke Newton, we have this stellium. The moon is moving towards the stellium of it's in Taurus, but moving towards all the planets that are sitting in Gemini. Something very important that's going on here in terms of the sun and the moon. One of the most basic things I want to teach out of the gate about the sun and the moon is the cycle. That's one of the most, connected we might feel with astrology is the moon, our relationship with the cycle of the moon. And when you go from new moon to full moon, and then the closing square, and then the final waning crescent, and then, balsamic, and then back to new moon, right? So we have in this instance a cycle of the moon. The moon is waning here, and it is getting closer and closer to a new moon moment. So it's kind of like finishing the cycle. So when we see a moon, things will manifest. I think in that final period of time before new moon is when things manifest actually quite rapidly because they're trying to finish the cycle. And so you can see that. It depends on, I think, the modality. So fixed signs, it's not as fast as, say, the cardinal, which happens very fast and mutable. So keep that in mind, okay? So once it hits into the Gemini to catch up to the sun, things will materialize quite rapidly in terms of finishing off the cycle. So point that out. We'll cover the moon and the sun and the moon and that whole cycle in another full-on video or two, so we can get an understanding of that. But that's what's triggering. So we kind of look at the fastest moving planets are the moon, and we call it a planet when we're doing astrology, same as the sun, right? And then Mercury is also very fast moving. So these planets, but Venus can also do it. But I kind of look at planets that move faster than the slower moving planets can act as triggers. And the two that are the ones I really look at the most are the moon and Mercury. Venus also can act as one, and Mars as well in different ways. But I want to point that out. It's kind of like, what is the movement? What's happening by the change of things, and what's activating something that is imprinted in the natal chart. So that's kind of something of a, essential astrology in terms of looking at the movement of things in relationship to the natal chart. Okay. So for Luke, that's very important. So he's definitely getting an activation on this part of his chart during that period of time. And it's actually going to, by square, when it's in Taurus, it activates everything by square. But once it catches up to the Uranus, it's activating something that is, really distilled in his core, in his DNA, fourth house, Pluto and Scorpio, something super, super deep in his consciousness. Okay. And we also want to take a look at, okay, the moon's activating that. So that's, an activation of sorts. And then also, and it's activating things that are visible to the public eye, things about sensuality, things about trust, and those kinds of things. They talk about trust and how to do scenes and things like that, like on a sexual, intimate, well, not sexual, but I guess you could say that intimate level, kind of intimacy, because having to work so closely and what that would look like on screen. They get into that kind of conversations in the interviews. They're also having a lot of fun with some food when they're in Canada. They talk about, or Toronto, they have the whole thing with the chips and or crisps, as they call them in the UK. But it's a kind of all the things that are emerging out of the Toronto interviews. Also, where is Mars? Because Mars to me is really important as it relates to that Scorpio energy. Also, that's kind of like when a planet is moving through a sign, like Mars is when they're in Toronto. Mars is moving through Aries in the transiting moment, the planetary transits of the moment, with Chiron that it had recently touched on. So there was something that was sensitive that's been recently touched on. And of course, we talked about the nodes. The nodes are very important. For the North node set is kind of a symbolic where things are manifesting in a way that is like the soul is leaning in towards that direction, but the habit is on the other end. So it's having to learn how to release something from a different point of perspective. So it's activating, but at the same time, it's like lean into this a bit more than maybe what you're comfortable with, because the comfortable spot is how you might relate where you relating and communicating before. So the soul lessons that are being learned or invited to take a new point of view, lean into the North Nodes. Like, this is where you're supposed to pay attention. This is where you're going to be releasing. So the releasing what you've done before in the past has, for Luke, would be related to relationship, relating, communicating, and perception, right? But it's marking when you're in travels, you're going to be invited to look at things in a new way. Instincts will be out and forward. Courage needs to be out and forward. Also, there could be conflict that you have to navigate while you're traveling. Ninth house is travel, foreign travel. You have to like get on a plane, or where you have to spend the night somewhere. Even if you drove across, 6-7 hours or something, and you had to stay the night somewhere before you came back, that is also a bit of a ninth house. Community that you travel in locally and can go back home, that's third house travel. Okay, just to give you a little bit there. But in Toronto, he's having to bring that forward. There may be some tension. There may be some tension that hasn't been resolved from something that was said at the end of the time in Rio, or that it's excitable because Mars can be a part of that raw energy coming out. So it might not be conflict right away, but it could be conflict that's emerging, or on the inner plane of the self. So you might have a conflict within yourself and you're becoming aware of it, right? It might, and I think this is the case for introverts, these two introverts, Luke and Nicola, because it might not be something they would say, but it's going to ooze out. It's going to show up in different ways because they haven't figured out a way how to express the thing that is of conflict within the self in a way that helps them navigate it to be in their truth. But at the same time, there's a situation that's brewing, right? I mean, that's absolutely happening here. And June, so this is June 3rd, and we've already hit the point in May with it, because New York, I think New York, the more I've looked at other videos in New York, there was tension that came out in New York, but it probably wasn't addressed as deeply as it should have been, or could have been, coulda, shoulda, woulda. I think it's valuable to always consider, like, Mars is very important for expressing passion, the instinctual part of our nature, and which is really important, I think, in some of the storyline in terms of how it took them so long to, speak to their truth in parts of that season 3. But I think there's a storyline between Luke and Nicola as well, right, in their own personal lives, and we're getting a little bit of that leak through in what we're all passionately interested in. But I think, considering Mars in Aries was about some of that just coming out, but also it's arising in the person's consciousness to, understand, like, oh, I'm in conflict with myself on that matter, or that person doesn't see me how I think I see me. Why? Right? Like, you start kind of like exploring these kinds of things on your inner plane of perception. And then you'll explore like what I've been saying, what I've been doing, so that's that inner conflict. And then you have to figure out, well, why was I behaving that way? Why was I doing that? I wasn't thinking about that. I was just doing my normal pattern, right? So that kind of helps initiate, very good word for that as well, to get into understanding yourself and why you do those things. And then you can decide, oh, now I have to make a conscious effort to change my behavior if I want to be different, if I want to evolve that to a different way of being. Hopefully that's a really interesting and clear way to state that. Okay. Also, when he's really getting activated a lot in Toronto during those interviews. Not only that it kind of oozes out and we get to pay attention to it and see it and go, oh, that's very interesting, but it's also that he is probably registering more as each day goes on, and especially when they get to Ireland, there's more. But I think there's definitely there's been this crescendo. It's almost like music. It's like it's building and building and building in the energy, and there was a build up to Rio for sure, and then I think passions were more forward in Rio. Maybe some things were said by Nicola as well somewhere in there, and now it's like possibly, or there's even just he's getting the attention through social media that begins to intensify, and he's having to register that as well. And it's also possible that in the situation with Antonia, that he's getting tension from that in terms of perception and having conversations. So there's multiple levels to probably what he was having to navigate in terms of, why do I behave that way? Why do I think that way? I mean, how I wonder much has he paid attention to some of the social media commentary on his jealousy, well, they've commented on they call it professional jealousy, but there's no such thing of just professional jealousy. Jealousy is just jealousy. It'll ooze out wherever, right? And the fact that it is when he's having that brought forward, communicated in his experience of life, is when he's acting with, in Bridgerton with Nicola, and they've communicated as, friends talking and sharing things and getting to know each other. So to me, Toronto is, it's a little bit on the agitation, on the inner world, the inner plane of going, oh, wow. If he observed himself back and picked up on any of those memes, it would become more and more aware of it, right? And then what are you going to do about it, right? Because you can acknowledge that you have something, but if you do not want to present that, then the task is understanding why you are that way. Why do you present that? Because it isn't just, it can be connected to that particular soul. That's the evolutionary, wave from the soul memory. That is very important to pick up on, because the task is, oh, I want to evolve that thing. That's why it's even presenting. That is something about evolutionary astrology, I'm going to say, because when you have something presenting that is like a rub on you, that is the task. That is the task. It's like, what can I do? What can I allow for myself as I try to process and integrate something new, or at least the information, right? Because so many souls have deep trauma. I mean, everybody walking the planet, basically here, walking planet Earth now, has some level of trauma because they're bringing it from past lives. But they don't really, there's what I call the consensus population doesn't really, the fact that you've been watching a video means that you're emerging or are on a path of consciousness, of understanding the self more deeply, so that you're healing something from the past or trying to figure out how to navigate it and not project it into the future. There is a balance between past, present, and future that's very important, because we often project into the future the repeating patterns. And that's the thing, is to break that patterning, you have to awaken to it. You have to figure out a way to get into your own emotional intelligence and start, things and practices, healing modalities that make sense to you. It can be holotropic breathing. It can be, studying astrology or the tarot, and also other, there's so many other esoteric, disciplines that you can explore and get to understand yourself. We have that to move through and help us navigate life in a more connected and be more embodied, for the soul, the spirit, and the body. So it's very, very important for that. And that's our whole evolution and how we are awakening and become the more of the potential of what we intended to become, right? I hope that makes sense. It's, of course, it's on a continuum, because there's always the soul has a desire to come back and maybe work on something else, because certain lives, each life has a particular focus of intention, right? Of what it wants to do and become. And it has kind of a direction of the spiral of its intention. I hope that makes sense. It gets very complex and layered, and that's what makes life so interesting. Anyway, so in terms of like what Luke was opening to understand about himself, it's apparent in the Toronto interviews for Luke that he was introduced to astrology somewhere between the Tudum interview, when they were looking at Colin and Penelope. I don't know exactly when that Tudum interview was done. If you know when that was recorded, I don't know if I have that information, but if you know when that Tudum interview was recorded, that would be great, because that might have been the initial opening for that. And then when they were in Australia, that was when they were looking at their own charts. I don't know if I think Luke only knew his sun sign when they were in, and I even think Nicola knew her sun sign, but she didn't mention anything beyond that in the Tudum interview. But in Australia, they were actually looking at their charts. So somewhere along that timeline is when they're like, when was I born, and put in their charts. Or they looked up, to even know the rising sign, she would have had to know their birth time. So they would have had to figure that out from getting it from their parents. Like, when was I born? And so I think that's, to me, there's an awakening that's happening for both of them to bring that into their lives, however little they do, but it's a start, right? Because astrology gives you even more precision, because I was an oracle card reader when I first started. I started, my gateway, I call it my gateway drug. My gateway into the esoteric sciences was numerology. I did numerology for 2 years. Yeah, I was playing with numerology. So when I was going through my awakening, I had numerology, and I had it so powerful in my consciousness at that period of time. I think it was 2010, 2009. Yeah, it was 2000. No, excuse me. It was 2008 and 9 when I was really heavy into numerology, even into 2010 when I had the opening into astrology, because I had it so in my conscious permeating me that the numbers were just popping out at me everywhere. It was a surreal experience. I just continued to grow and have an awareness that I couldn't go further with the numerology until I had astrology. I know that sounds, and then by the imagery, when I did the oracle reading, when I first kind of started dabbling in everything esoteric, the oracle, I could read the image and I felt like it was really an odd experience, and it could have been just the timing of my own planetary transits at the time, but it was so powerful for me at that time that the oracle, I made people cry so often. It was kind of a little bit like, oh, this is overwhelming how much I could see with an image, and then presented that to someone and then, tears. But I felt inside of me when I was doing the oracle card reading a little bit more like, where is this coming from? Right? Like I was a little bit like nervous by my novice being, so new to it. And then, numerology didn't scare me as much. It's just that when I got to astrology, it was more that it was so powerful and more precise that I could actually see more. And then, I felt like, I have more confidence in what I'm reading, in the symbolism. So, there's that. I mean, so I really love to listen to tarot reading, but, it's powerful. But I think to me, I wanted something that would slice through time more with better visuals that I could present to people because of the symbolism that astrology offers. So to me, I kind of like put astrology as a bit more powerful, at least from my perspective and my mind, how it would register it. So, and the fact that they picked up on the astrology makes me, I was so fascinated by that when they started talking about the astrology in those interviews in Toronto, that I kind of wondered, it's like, oh, I wonder if this is a part of their journey that they need it to explore things that might be non-traditional, because that Aquarian energy in their charts, it's Luke's, 7th house. So the fact that his friend and co-lead Nicola was probably the one presenting it to him. And then for how powerful it is for Luke, it actually can help be a guide, if he has the right guides, to navigate and diving in to do some of that inner work. Right? He could do a lot of meditation and get there on his own in a lot of ways, because I studied for 3 years all by myself without other outside influences before I let that out in terms of going and meeting with other astrologers. Because I wanted to kind of understand it from my own, pulling numerous charts to get to that knowledge where I feel like, oh, okay, I kind of know I can get through this and navigate. It takes about 3 years actually in studying, pulling charts, asking questions of yourself to what you're looking at, and then, oh, okay, that's how it's presenting. That's how it's presenting. That's how it's presenting. And I think that if anyone does that kind of study for themselves, they're going to come up with awareness that only you can get from your own kind of relationship with it, if that makes any sense. So I'm excited. I wonder really like what level they may take in exploring their astrology, and then maybe how it bears into the characters that they play, or the period of time that they are in their own kind of life experience, and what the astrology is of the moment. When they unlock that, when, if more actors understood the power of the astrology in the moment, it's happening anyway, because we can do numerous chart after chart after chart to pick up themes that the actors are going to be putting on screen. But it might actually help an actor, if they know astrology, to, even pull out finer details, because I really think that is something Luke Newton has in his face when he's acting, and the energy that it puts out, and certain co-leads are going to bring that out more in him, just like his connection with Nicola, right? Because that all that Aquarian energy and that mirroring effect that it has. There are other famous musicians, celebrities that have this mirroring effect, and I think especially the younger generation is so interested in the concept of mirroring. I'm noticing that that is more amplified now than it ever was even 10 years ago. They're mirroring, they're so connected, these kinds of things. And it's fascinating to see how that is in the astrology of the individuals that are doing, having the mirror effect. What else do I want to talk about Toronto? For Luke, it's just a period of we're going to have a lot be revealed. So there's a lot in the moment while they're in Toronto that helps us see more of the depth of who they are, because we get the information for astrology. So where is that? To me, it is in the air of the Gemini. So it's a bit like the cerebral, the mind is one, but the leaks are more the energy of Pisces. So having that information leak out into our awareness of it is more Pisces, high energy, the heavier, the more extreme, the slow planets. Saturn is slower, Neptune incredibly slower, and Neptune at 29 degrees Pisces is quite significant. And that is amplifying the potential for information that might be protected otherwise getting leaked out, right? Because that Saturn is square his nodes, you see. And when you have something like that, that's the leak, that is like stuff that's the occult, stuff that's hidden. And that's, the occult is 8th house. And so it's almost like the teacher has come to say, we have it available now and we can learn something about it. And on a soul level, a higher self level, there is a participation with that in their own energy, right? So even though in maybe their own personal incarnate personality life, what I call the ego mind of being on the planet Earth in, Luke Newton, he may not be aware of how energy works on the higher planes, but there's higher levels of awareness when you're looking into things beyond in the other realms and these kinds of things. But the Saturn is a teacher. It also is karmic. It also bears time. But when you have Saturn in Pisces, you have an energy that it takes the shape of whatever you're putting it into. So it's conscious. So to me, Pisces is the whole of the whole zodiac. So the experience of the whole. And then Saturn is, I'm going to give you some shape to it so you can kind of understand a point of perspective, for you understand something that's almost rather undefinable. Because Pisces has that element to it, because especially with Neptune in there. Neptune in Pisces is like the undefinable. It comes from the other realm. It is imagination. Where's that coming from really, right? Like, what is our relationship, our consciousness, and the parts that are not conscious but then emerge that we might be afraid of those things that would, that's the whole point of Moby Dick, if you think about that novel. Go into that another time, but there's something very powerful about the thing that's emerging, things that are emerging from that place of the depths that we can't even understand, so I believe the Moby Dick, I really connect that to when Neptune, the timing of Neptune being discovered as a planet and our consciousness awakening. Moby Dick is almost like a symbolism of that, and I'll go into that later. But I want to point that out because Saturn square his nodes is almost like this karmic moment in time, and it's an extended period of time. It's not just Toronto, but it's Toronto, and then also if we think about his progressed Sun and his progressed Mercury being at 18 degrees of Pisces in the progressed chart, to me, there's this illumination of the 8th house happening for Luke Newton on another plane of his being. And it's so important for his life trajectory, right? Like, these moments are so important for the fullness of Luke Newton. I don't even know how to fully articulate that, but that Saturn in transit in Pisces at 18 degrees, squaring his nodes while he's in Toronto, and the sharing of the astrology and all the things that are happening in those moments in Toronto are very powerful for him to explore across all the time of his life. Make sense? Because it's been hidden, and now it's getting a viewpoint, and it's releasing and opening, and the invitation to understand consciousness is there, right? So powerful. Another thing to keep in mind that's going on. Now, the vertex is important as it is the anti-vertex would be on his moon. And that is only at the noon moment, because I think how the vertex is calculated, but I think it's important to kind of take into consideration because of the positioning at, when the sun is at the highest point in the day at noon, right? In June, yeah, I think it's probably pretty tight in terms of how it is in the heavens, because it's getting closer and closer to the solstice, which would be June 21st, 22nd, right? The summer solstice in the northern hemisphere. So that, in terms of the angle of where the sun is in the sky. So I think the Saturn is so important for Luke Newton. And when it's in Pisces, it's accentuating this to understand his own Saturn, which is in Aquarius at 20 degrees. And Psyche has been, there, and it was moving to be exact by the time they got to the London premiere. So that, to me, there's an exacting thing here with the Psyche and his own Psyche. Right? So there's something emerging about his understanding of, maybe, the invitation is there. When the soul picks up certain things to bring it to his awareness, it'll be very interesting to see how much of what he learns through that understanding and new awareness starts to show up. I think we've seen it over the summer, by the way, certain actions that he has taken to go into isolation, because the Saturn being in Pisces is it's asking him to go there, to go to isolation, to start figuring things out on a deeper level about consciousness. But at first, when you're first stumbling into astrology, esoteric sciences, there is so much chaos and confusion, because it feels like you're having a lot of difficult situations confront you in your 3D, what I call the 3D, your world, your life on the outer expression, outer experience, what people can observe about you and maybe comment about you. But it's the internal plane where a million questions can start coming up, like, why am I here? What's my purpose? Why are these things happening? Why am I faced with this again? So he may have at some point asked that question of himself, because he was facing very similar trends from the masses, the collective fandom, and the fandom behaves in very much of a hive mind when it's operating on a more of a negative train. Let's just say that. When it's positive, well, yay. But, he's getting an understanding of, and it's from patterns from the past that he's trying to heal something, right? But it's more like becoming more aware. It's like, oh, wait a minute. This is the same situation, just a different person. He may ask, he might be like, what's going on? So the common denominator, it's connected to him, right? Why? So when those big existential questions start emerging, now you're on the track, right? So you may have the same thing. You're like, wow, I've had relationships, and it was like certain repeating patterns that came up in different relationships was just a different person, but the same issues presented, right? That is the recognition of the pattern from a relationship, and what it can teach you about yourself and the deeper parts of yourself that have emerged from another, from your unconscious mind, then be presenting like who you might be attracted to. Why are you being attracted to that person? It's because the frequency that you hold and the pattern that you hold. And it will be stunning when you start exploring that part of yourself and understand, oh, to get something else, I have to change my behavior. I have to lean into something completely different. I have to change my pattern. But the whole thing of it is that you can change. You have the power within you to change, but you will have things that you will have to navigate because they're part of the design of your life. And that design has been you doing it on another level. Okay. And that might be more mind-blowing, but this is the part of the self that is beyond time, beyond a body, the part of yourself that is always there. Okay. You can take astrology from a non-spiritual perspective. You absolutely can. You can take it from, this was my early childhood years and the conditioned pattern of my upbringing, and then what I am untangling the knots of my childhood when I'm an adult by what I learned in my youth that was then buried in the unconscious mind. We can totally take all astrology from that perspective. Now, imagine the power when you understand that there is something emerging from a very past experience that's still embedded in the mind, because you were not born with a blank slate. You were born with the birth chart that has points of reference, and the points of reference go beyond time. They are just reflected in time. Okay. So For Luke Newton, Toronto was a layered chapter by chapter of information that's in those interviews, in those experiences that help him understand part of the arc of the life, and that he is on the trail to go and seek isolation more than he had even before for a period of time, so he can understand things about himself and start asking bigger questions. And it might have him pursue esoteric studies of some sort. So, or he's participating from a distance in that he's even given us this information, and it's being explored by all the tarot readers that are reading him. I think there is, here's the thing that's in the, at least in the astrology community, I have no idea. There's such a community of readers in social media, and I have an opinion about that, but I'm going to be very cautious because I think every level offers something, but it can be dangerous if people give away their power too much when they're participating in such readings. Okay, so here's my thought on that. There are many astrologers and many readers will limit how many times someone can come and see them in a given year. Now, if you are in what I call a dark night of the soul, you may need more kind of learning from someone who can help dive in with astrology as you navigate that path. But what I'm trying to say is that those readings that are too frequent can be a bit of an abusive in terms of someone's power that they embody, because you could give away your power if you're doing it over and over and over again, and it dilutes the power of the reading, the initial reading. There can be different focused readings, I think, but I think if it's done too frequently, the individual who's getting the reading is at risk of the vulnerability of a power dynamic in that relationship. So there's a caution there, if you know what I mean. I encourage people to study and I encourage people to get readings, but I also caution too much is diluting your own power to find the answers within as well. Okay, yeah, that's what I'll say about that for now. The age of technology is absolutely something. While Pluto in transit goes through Aquarius, so this planet here, Pluto, starting on November 19th, Pluto will return to Aquarius, because right now it's actually in Capricorn on 29 degrees of Capricorn, which I think was September 2nd, and it retrograde back into there. And November 19th, it goes back to Aquarius, re-enters, and then it'll be there for 20 years. And I think it's very important to understand that during that time that Pluto is transiting Aquarius, there is going to be a massive transformation about our awareness of technology and how invasive it is in our lives and our private lives, and how it is. Yeah, it's we already know it. We already have some data, and we have an awareness of how it is impacting the psychological health and mental well-being of especially our youth, but I also think adults. So yeah, I think during the transit of Pluto in Aquarius, we're going to have a lot of transformation as relates to technology and our relationship with it and within it. And also new technologies. We're also going to have like the importance of the individual within a group, I guess, without having to form ourselves around one, like a king. That's the best example I can. It's more like the awareness that we are connected, but you have your individuality, your individual self, your soul is such a fingerprint. It is so unique, it has a unique voice, and there's a purpose within the whole, which is super powerful. And when you value yourself and respect that part of yourself, you will be more embodied, more in the world, more sharing, more who you always, the design of the whole thing, right? So, I call it the age of Aquarius, but we're emerging in the age of Aquarius for like 200 years, by the way, 250 years or something like that. I would put it as definitely when Pluto is going through there, it's kind of like moving towards that, liberating what groups, national, even how people might identify themselves in terms of from whatever nation. And so it can get concerning in different points in time, the breakup of what we once knew and something emerging, and I'm not saying that the what is emerging is all positive. There's yin and yang in everything, right? But it's interesting to see what is evolving. How do we as human beings, as individuals, but also within the collective group of the whole planet Earth, or how we identify ourselves is, changing forever. right? Like we can go back and maybe I'll do this in another video, look at the Pluto and Capricorn era and all the things that we've learned collectively about what was corrupt in the system of our collective systems. And, how did that shape us? How did that put in our experience, our desire for change and those kinds of things, right? So Pluto is super powerful. It is the transformation. It's a planet of transformation, and it is going to transform it so it's not even recognizable from where it was before. It will be like, no, we know that now. Will things sneak through? Yes. Some things some things do not emerge during the period of time when Pluto is transiting that sign. But that means to me that it wasn't to be seen in that point in time. It's going to emerge in another time. So there were a lot, for example, when Pluto moved through Capricorn, we've had a lot of things emerge in archaeology that were rediscovered, things that were buried in the earth and then come forward again. And with that, new information. But also in astrology, in the astrology community itself, we've had the emergence of the Hellenistic traditions because of what has been translated from ancient texts in Arabic or in Latin or Italian. And there's various languages that these ancient texts were translated and brought forward so many different ways to look at astrology that we had not had because it had been buried in the past. It's a project called Project Hindsight. And so we even have traditional astrology being like having a renaissance because of that kind of emerging. But I believe that emerged probably during 2 or 3 signs of Pluto through a couple of signs. So I'm going to say that. But it's really kind of moved the scale of interest in the period of time that Pluto has been in Capricorn. Okay. So anyway, I want to, point these things out because I think it lends to understanding the astrology that these individuals, kind of the planetary transits of the moment. And for Luke Newton it's so clear that this is such a huge moment because his north node is in Sagittarius, and that is ruled by Jupiter, and Jupiter making its transit through Taurus in the beginning of the tour, but then tipping over into Gemini is bringing on something else online that's important for information, for communication, but also it brings a little bit of chaos. And it ties into his south node. And his south node is going to bring up something from the past that has to be made visible for him to get it. But it'll take, taking the experience, but sometimes it can take a decade, even 2 decades to unravel the thing of one experience. Okay. But in terms for Luke, this is such a huge period of time that he could be unraveling it. There's so much information that was given in the experience. And I'm sure it was so much information and energy coming at him and Nicola at the same that, and different themes for each of them as individuals and his nodes and also her nodes, because she's in a nodal return, but the energy is being accentuated on his south node during Toronto, when they go to Ireland also, and when he goes, and then the London premiere, and then into this summer and until Jupiter enters Cancer next year. No, it's February 4th. And then it stations direct in February 2025. And that is at 11 degrees. So what is important is Luke is going to have this period of time when Jupiter is passing through his south node 3 times. Basically, it's the first time it hits it, and then it goes stations to go retrograde from our point of view on Earth, and then it'll hit it again on the retrograde, and then station to go to direct, and then it'll hit it again on the 3rd time. So basically, when I'm speaking with individuals about that kind of transit, when it's hitting their nodes, the lunar nodes, it's really these huge life moments that offers perspective of something that is changing in their awareness of it, because Jupiter is how we expand. But when it's on the south node, it's our awareness of it. And so for Luke, it's expanding friends, allies, Gemini. So the yin and yang, Gemini is curious, it's learning, it's asking questions, these kinds of things. But Gemini is also, it can be comedic, but Gemini is also the this and that of things, like the two-ness of things, it can have perspectives like that. Gemini is very fact based versus philosophy based. And I know that he's leaning in more to the creative self. So what is he learning from the friend groups? What is he learning from allies? Because there are certain people in our life that are catalysts. They're, because they're showing us another point of view. And let me give you an example. So he may contrast his relationships because his Jupiter is in the third house in Libra, right? How he is with, let's go with one of his first girlfriends was Sophie from the Lodge. Yeah, so he had a relationship with Sophie when he was younger, right? That was pre-Saturn return. And then he had a relationship with Jade that came in. He connected with Jade in 2020. And so that was before the massive fame. But then the experiences with Jade and also with Antonia are similar in theme. The attacking of social, people in the fandom or people who connect on social media who really don't know anything about him, really, the attacks that happen. And so there's this kind of confrontation with the public. And that's part of his theme of his, that I've discussed about evolutionary intentions, is for him to overcome being in the public eye, and that what's the identity he creates based on that experience, right? But also to get rid of the fear, right? Like that's, to me, is the bottom line is how do you how do you protect yourself, deal with that mob kind of mindset, and still be yourself and still do your thing, but also be fully aware of it, like the power of it. And he's had that in two cases. Nicola is another component in that because she is the participating as what people expect in that mob. I call it mob, but it can be like that phantom. So to me, it's powerful for him to like, oh, there's this repeating theme that's slightly different for each person, but still it depends also on that individual who's a part of the equation. So Jade, for example, of course, I do not know I haven't even pulled Jade's chart. I know she was born in May, so she's probably Taurus. So that puts her very visible in his chart, right? But because she was so connected to horses, there's something also about Sagittarius in her. So I don't know what that is. Maybe her moon is in Sagittarius or something like that. But what I think is there is an example of, a fairly healthy relationship, but then it hit a wall when something was going on underneath in their own psychology. And then it was presented also in the pressures of the outside world, kind of, it's almost like how diamonds, they have to take the pressure to become the diamond kind of thing. For Jade, there were certain things that maybe she was experiencing in her own inner world and her own in relationship to Luke. And as things emerged relative to Bridgerton, and then maybe choices that she made that she might not have made in another situation, but because of that pressure and experiences, maybe she did make personal choices that maybe she needed to take another path or whatever, because of how it was a pressure cooker and it wasn't ideal for her. So to me, that's a possibility with relationships. It's like, this is not how I want to live my life, or this is not the right combination for me, because it is bringing parts of myself that I don't like about myself when I'm with this person. You know what I mean? That can be something that we learn about ourselves. Is that the same with Nicola? Is that the same? So I think what emerges from Luke, possibly only from what I can see visibly with this, is what he is learning about himself in relationship, connected to her. And if he let that energy, kind of what we see in the videos from New York premiere, Antonia being there, and it's rumored, I don't know the absolute facts on this, but I think Antonia's presence there was possibly by someone else, and then he just had to go along with it, but I don't know if that's for certain. But what I do sense in part of those videos is that he's very, very uncomfortable in parts of that premiere in New York behind the scenes that we didn't catch till later, that remind me that the presence of someone that is totally conflicting with something else that we hold in a relationship, like the connection between like his relationship to Nicola and having Antonia there is like very disruptive for his own energy, right? And then he's highly concerned about how that's being received by Nicola, right? And concerned for, my relationship now with Nicola is at risk because this is here. So that's emerging for him. So for him to be aware of that, right? So that's one way to get at the past and get at the understanding of like mixing, oil and water like that. So that kind of thing. So he has to, each incident, so that it leads up to June 12th and that whole disruptive thing. It's a bigger issue. It becomes really visible, right? So that was just an emerging thing, an emerging pattern that had to be taken to that for him, karmic wave breaking. Wake up, that's the wake up call. right? Then it's the fallout. You have the fallout after the fact. And then it's still like, what do you feel? What do you think? And what, a person has the right to desire a certain person or whatever, but he's having to manage through multiple points of perception, and then what he wants to have in his life, and then how he's going to protect himself and then protect the people he's connected with, right? So there's certain behaviors that he will change, and he has been changing over the summer, that clue us in that that's absolutely taking place, right? So how he's managing his social media, that is completely changed. I think that's also changed for Nicola. Like, I still think Nicola, and I think when Luke is connected more to Nicola, he's more willing to play the game of celebrity in a way that is like what Taylor Swift does, it's almost gamifying it, like putting people on a quest, right? And then still having way more privacy than what was before, right? But I still think there's a learning curve that's happening here for Luke Newton. But the moments in Toronto, Canada, when they were on the promo tour for Luke, was absolutely giving us that, us the insights, like, oh, there's so much more going on here, and we're starting to get a lot of the clues, and also what's registering in his conscious, and then it's going to be pushed back into the unconscious, but he has to pull it back out again at another point in time. The social media, the volume of it, what does he take from it? Like, of course, there's the fun stuff that we like, the memes, they're fun, but it's more like the commentary, the words that are critical and shared, that's, and also what the importance of mental health, right? So there's all of that. That's all in the planets of the moments of Toronto. So that is for Luke Newton. What else do I want to point out here? So the most important thing, I think, is that the Saturn square the nodes, the highlight of all those planets coming towards his south node, are going to highlight that intensity. Now, even though it's highlighting the lunar nodes, okay, with all of those planets moving towards, and as they get towards June 12th, when that karmic wave is breaking, you can see that at the same, in that moment in Toronto, which is very interesting, I also think, is the Venus is with the sun, is what we call Kazemi. It's Kazemi the sun. This is maybe a term that you might hear in other astrology videos, but when a planet is in the same degree as the sun, it's Kazemi. It's under the beams. But when it's in Kazemi is, in traditional astrology, in the chariot. So in the chariot with the sun. So it has a certain power when it's present like that. When it goes to like 1 degree away, it's under the beams and loses power. Okay, that's a traditional astrology concept. It just amplifies what the theme of the sun is in evolutionary astrology. Here are my thoughts on that. Based on my study of both traditional astrology and evolutionary astrology, both hold true in their own right, and what your point of perception on something. Okay, so Venus, Kazemi the sun, is the things that Venus is responsible for are in the chariot with the sun, with so much in his career, because Venus is the ruler of Taurus, and Venus is the ruler of Libra. And there's also, kind of from a traditional standpoint, Venus is exalted in Pisces, so there's also the connection to Pisces from a traditional standpoint. But definitely the domain of Venus is Taurus and Libra. Okay. And when she's connected like a Kazemi like this at 13 degrees in the chariot with the sun, there's a certain power to it. So in that day, June 3rd, from a woman's standpoint, and the projection of the animus, which is onto the partner, it's the parts of the masculine self that we need from the partner to help, we don't own. So we project it and expect them to hold that image up for us and be that part for us. And so a lot of that happens in relationships. I mean, that's the psychology on it, right? Like, we can go into that, but it's interesting. It's Carl Jung's material. If you want to dive into that, it's very deep. But I think it's important to kind of also look at it from an astrological standpoint. I kind of look at Venus as the feminine, masculine is Mars, in terms of the planets that we express in our experience, either on an internal plane or externally in our world. And so the Venus and the Mars are very important in terms of how we relate with one another, right? And the feminine is a magnetism. It's such a different, we live in a world that's very yang, but there are societies that are more yang than they are yin, right? There are certain societies that show more yin in terms of how they operate as a collective group. But on the individual level, it's an interesting thing when you get into how different cultures represent femininity, right? With women, or how that can be expressed. And in the United States, it's a very interesting thing right now. Maybe if you're in Europe and you're in, I don't know, France, or I don't know, Spain, how a woman may express her femininity is maybe different than, a large swath of women in the United States, for example, or in the Northern Hemisphere. I think it's interesting to kind of look at these concepts. I mean, of course, at an individual level, everybody has their own way they express themselves. I mean, as long as from my perspective on myself, I have feminine things that I like to express, but I also feel that I have been tempered in my life to not express based on family, culture, certain things. In the corporate world, what was unacceptable to do, I had to be more masculine, expressed, my Mars more expressed, those kinds of things. In the corporate world, almost act like a man. I love Taylor Swift's song, I'd Be the Man. Love that song. Anyway, I think it's important. These are such we live and breathe this stuff, right? Like, and then we don't give it a second thought. But when we get kind of into reflective mode and kind of diving into self-exploration, it's super powerful, right? So with Luke, that his Venus is so important. And in Toronto, having Venus in the chariot with the sun in his 11th house is fortunate and it's going to be incredibly insightful for him to understand his Mercury and the relationship with other people and how it is in his consciousness and what is under transformation. There's more than that. I mean, because there's other aspects, and aspects are, these two at 13 degrees, how do they touch other things in his chart, or even by the transiting, planets in transit. The north node is at 12 degrees, which is sextile. That to me is, this combination is they are visible to each other and informing each other and can empower him in some ways. And so that's pointing to ninth house of higher learning and these kinds of things, and his instinctual nature, what he can learn about himself through that deep dive of awareness around that and for himself. But I think maybe he's probably more apt to discover the challenges as it represents the karmic indications based in time and the events that did play out in time relative to that. And it's like kind of pay attention to the feminine energy and then the duality that's in his present. So the duality of awareness around how he feels, that's feminine, how he feel, and then what that attracts in. But it's also then what he projects on to other people that are women. So Antonia and Nicola in this scenario, right? But he also may have some perspective later on about that projection as it related to Jade. So there's a lot of information that he is getting, and there's also insights that can come out for him to get into the parts of himself that evoke certain things that he's going to experience. But he also can make a choice about how he changes his behavior, how he changes his perception the deeper he dives, right? So that's important to point out. Okay, so I think I've covered that one a lot. The only last thing would be Eros is opposite this piece of his natal chart, which is the Neptune and Uranus. Uranus in Capricorn, Neptune. And as I've shared in other videos, this combination, those born in the early 90s, the late 80s, like 89, 90, 91, 92, 93, 94. Yeah, they have this combination that's just a profound, it's a marked, very strong planetary combination, outer planets, for what they are to the collective. So those souls born around that time, and the importance of, they're like a peaking moment for the millennials in their birth, and that they are change agents. I call them change agents because their combination in Capricorn like that on the outer planets is kind of like the bringers of chaos to create change. I love that. Anyway, it's interesting to have Eros in the opposition that activate, this is activating something in the consciousness, and there's, some wounds around it as well. I mean, Chiron, it's just pointing out like the right to exist, but the desire is sensitive and wants protection. I mean, Cancer wants to nurture, but it also has the desire to protect. It's kind of like multifold to be able to nurture, to have your desire to nurture, to this is in his, is is transiting his unconscious mind. And, that's important to point out because it's in his 12th house. And his moon more than likely is in Cancer as well. So it's kind of activating those parts of the self, how he feels and can register, right? Like consciously about himself. It would first be in the unconscious mind and then would come out for him, like in how he feels about it. So it's almost like having also a moment where a bit of chaos has hit that part of himself and it'll just start popping out in different areas of life because he has the desire nature is being activated. So in some of the interviews, his desire nature is absolutely activated when Nicola talks about Ryan Gosling, right? And so it's almost he can't even contain his hands, his head, all his body movements in that one little split moment give some insights on that, right? The desire nature. But the desire nature is so powerful because it leads to understanding the feminine. And, I'll go more into depth on that later. But the Psyche and Eros, to me, that whole story it's an emerging truth about the feminine rising and the feminine becoming more prominent in our psyche, our collective psyche. But there are certain people that may activate certain things in us collectively as we observe them, like Luke Newton and Nicola, and that connection. And there are others like them, maybe not in the same realm, but they, that have activated us in the past. But theirs is so potent, and the storyline and everything that's been picked up on this, I think the feminine just is like permeating that what we are picking up energetically. Okay, it's like the divine feminine is like, I'm here. And Luke is a vehicle for through us observing him as a part of that relationship of understanding that. And I think that's part of the attractor beam to these two. Okay, so we've covered so much with Luke Newton in Toronto. And so I'm going to go into the next slide and we'll take a look at Nicola.